Marissa's day didn't start well. Her head was pounding with pain, and all she wished for was to be far away from the noisy office, preferably by a cool river or by the sea. She imagined gentle waves rolling onto the sand and the warm sun tickling her shoulders, helping her relax a little. However, she didn't have much time to daydream. Her boss was waiting for the quarterly report. Marissa was his favorite, the most responsible and punctual of his subordinates, practically his right hand, and this unspoken title did not give her peace. So, she constantly felt the burden of responsibility. Suddenly, the office door opened, and her assistant, Abby, announced that a visitor had come with a personal matter. "Marissa, I'm surprised. I'm not expecting anyone. But okay, tell her to come in." Marissa straightened her back, adjusted her hair with a barely noticeable movement, and slipped her feet into her shoes, which she had kicked off under the table to relax a little. A woman about 10 years younger than Marissa entered the office. She introduced herself as Jessica and looked challengingly at Marissa. "I came to tell you to leave Zachary alone," the visitor boldly declared, and every word echoed unpleasantly in Marissa's head. "How am I bothering him? And why should I leave my own husband?" Marissa calmly asked, though she was very surprised by the stranger's demands. "Because you're keeping him. You're no longer young, and he feels sorry for you. But he loves me," gasped Jessica, struggling for breath amid her emotions. Jessica explained that she was an orphan who had fallen madly in love with Zachary. Marissa's husband, Zachary, felt the same way, but he was unable to be with Jessica because of his wife, who refused to let him go, citing an incurable illness or some other reason. According to Jessica, poor Zachary was completely tormented, torn between his feelings and his duty. "And besides, we're going to have a child." Jessica shouted so loudly that the entire office heard her. "Get out of our way. Don't leave the child fatherless. You're already getting old. Why do you need a husband who's only with you out of pity? Give him freedom. He's still young at heart. Let him be happy." Marissa couldn't hide her surprise. She was certainly disappointed that Zachary had prepared such a gift for her on their 10th wedding anniversary. Yet, on the other hand, the situation seemed almost funny. "Don't worry. I'll talk to my husband today. It's time for me to go to a nursing home, and he still has his whole life ahead of him. Go, and I'll take care of everything," Marissa said with a smirk as she looked at the confused girl. When Jessica left the office, Marissa leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes again. She and Zachary had been married for 10 years and, at first, hadn't thought about children because they were focused on their careers. A couple of years ago, they finally decided it was time to have a child, but it didn't work out. Marissa thought the stress from their demanding jobs was to blame, but then she decided to check their health, and just yesterday, she picked up the results of their tests, which clearly stated that Zachary cannot have children. That was why Jessica's story about her pregnancy cheered Marissa up. Now she most wanted to talk to her husband and see his reaction. Citing poor health, Marissa left work early and went home. "We need to talk seriously," her husband began as soon as she entered the room. "Jessica came to see you today." "Oh, your mistress?" "Yes, she came. She told me, I'm too old for you and it's time to set you free. And she also mentioned that she couldn't resist your charm and was now waiting for a child from you." "Well, why are you like that?" Zachary asked. "Yes, I'm guilty, but I wasn't going to leave you. We've been through so much together. And Jessica, she's so young and naive. She's not to blame for anything. If she offended you, I'll talk to her and she'll apologize." Marissa felt herself starting to boil with anger. Not only did his mistress have the audacity to come to her workplace and say all that, but her husband clearly thought she was a complete fool. "Zachary, do you even hear yourself? I don't need her apologies. On your continued presence in this house, pack your things and leave immediately before I start a real scandal." Zachary lowered his head and went to pack his things. Already standing at the threshold with his bag, he hesitated and made one more attempt to fix things. "Marissa, let's not get too heated. Maybe we can somehow fix everything. I still love you, my dear hubby." "I have said everything," Marissa retorted. "And besides, what are you talking about? You have a child on the way." "Oh yes, the child," Zachary exclaimed. "Then, of course, it's better for me to leave." He opened the door, but Marissa suddenly called out to him, handed him the test results, advised him to study them more carefully, and slammed the door in his face. She heard Zachary didn't leave. Apparently, while trying to understand what was written, he finally realized something and began screaming hysterically, pounding on the door in a fit of hysteria. "Marissa, what does this all mean? Explain it to me," he shouted. "That's not my question, Zachary. Let your darling Jessica explain to you who the father of her child is. Leave me alone." Marissa shouted through the closed door. After hearing Zachary call the elevator and leave, Marissa felt a moment of sympathy for him. However, she quickly remembered that he wasn't worth it. Suddenly, she realized how tired she was from the day's events. She went into the guest room, lay down on the couch, covered herself with a big, fluffy blanket, and finally allowed herself to cry. It was so painful to realize that she had been betrayed. Marissa reminisced about how she and Zachary had bumped into each other on the street almost 12 years ago. At the time, he was a clumsy, nearsighted medical student who had knocked a box out of her hands. Despite his nervous stuttering, Marissa had helped him believe in himself, and he eventually underwent laser eye surgery, transforming into a confident and handsome young doctor. Marissa's friends envied her for having such a great partner, and she believed him because Zachary had always said that he loved only her. Yet the betrayal of her husband had deprived Marissa of her last strength, and it began to affect her work. Her boss, a very fair leader who valued his employees, noticed this and, with a tone that tolerated no objections, sent Marissa to rest by the sea. Marissa tried to choose a quiet place away from popular, noisy resorts. For the first few days, she simply lay on the beach, enjoying the warm rays of the sun, the gentle sea breeze, and the sound of the waves. But after a few days, she became bored and began discreetly observing the other vacationers. Her attention was particularly drawn to a young man, about 25 years old, who was dashing toward the waves with childlike enthusiasm and frolicking on the shore with the children. Some kind of freak, thought Marissa, or maybe wild. Has he never seen the sea before? An adult, but behaving like a boy. On one hand, his behavior bewildered her, yet on the other, she found herself intrigued by his childishness and unbridled energy. It plunged her back into her own childhood, when she too could be spontaneous. Maybe Jessica was right. Am I really turning into an old woman? Marissa unexpectedly mused. That evening, feeling sad, Marissa went to the nearest bar, even though she had avoided such places for a week. The thought that she had become too boring and old depressed her, and she decided to act against her principles and try to have some fun in a noisy company. At the bar, she noticed the same guy from the beach. He also noticed her and even waved, inviting her to sit next to him. Marissa pretended not to notice and took a seat at the other end of the bar. "Hi," she heard someone say. "May I sit down?" Marissa looked up and saw the same young man again. Unexpectedly, she agreed and let him sit down. He introduced himself as Cameron, and she gave her name, trying to seem as indifferent as possible. "I noticed that you didn't really like how I behaved today on the beach. I know I acted like a child, but that's exactly how I felt the first time I saw the sea. Are you serious?" Marissa asked, surprised. Cameron nodded and explained that his parents had insisted on the trip. He lived in a small town and, immediately after school, started working with his father in an auto repair shop. After 5 years of work without a vacation, his parents decided to give him a gift for his 25th birthday by sending him to rest in these beautiful places. Cameron asked if Marissa had been to the sea before, and she simply replied that she had, several times. Marissa could have boasted about being a successful, mature woman who had visited many world-class resorts, but for some reason, she did not want to elevate herself in front of this naive working man. Somehow, imperceptibly, they began talking, even though they had nothing in common except loneliness and a love for the sea. Cameron was too simple for Marissa, but his youth, directness, sincerity, and overflowing energy did their job. After a few cocktails, Marissa unexpectedly found herself in the arms of this new acquaintance. To her surprise, Marissa realized that she had never been as satisfied in bed with anyone else as she had been with Cameron. Zachary was handsome, but not particularly gentle in bed, However, Marissa had loved her husband and even forgiven him. Now, looking at the sleeping Cameron, she could hardly understand how she had ever lived like this before. By morning, the fog of passion and alcohol had cleared, and she looked at things realistically. These relationships had no future. Yes, they were good for a time, but everyone had to return to their usual life. Cautiously, Marissa slipped out from under the covers, left Cameron's room, and then, after gathering her things, left the hotel that same morning. She felt ashamed of her escape because Cameron didn't deserve it, but she could not act otherwise. On the way home, Marissa burst into tears, not knowing why. At work, she immersed herself in her papers, trying not to think about her loneliness, but in the evenings, she kept recalling the sunny beach and the cheerful guy splashing among the waves. Often, Marissa regretted not leaving Cameron her phone number or address, but then she convinced herself that nothing would have worked out between her and the poor guy from the car repair shop anyway. Marissa had tried to meet people through social networks and even went on a couple of dates, but the empty stories of her companions about vacations at expensive resorts, prestigious cars, and the like did not interest her at all. Her thoughts constantly returned to Cameron. Meanwhile, Zachary had tried to come back into her life several times. After a DNA test accurately confirmed that the child was not his, he parted with Jessica. Just imagine, she wasn't even an orphan. She was constantly deceiving me, he complained to his ex-wife. Forgive me, Marissa. We were so good together. Let's start over. Zachary, I haven't been interested in you for a long time. I advise you to find a normal woman and live with her peacefully, and let me fix my life too. I'll never be able to forgive you for your meanness, especially now that I know you're not an honest man, and besides, you weren't even a great lover, Marissa retorted. Zachary was shocked by her words and decided she was just taking revenge on him out of spite, hitting him where it hurt most, but Marissa truly felt that way. After a night with Cameron, she realized that there were no true feelings left in her relationship with her husband. It is unknown how Marissa's life would have turned out if it weren't for her assistant, Abby. Recently, the two had become good friends, often sitting together in a cafe and going bowling or skating on weekends. When the hot summer arrived, Marissa felt how the heated city pressed in on her with its noise and stuffiness. She began to suffer from migraines again, and her reluctance to sit in the office all day and then return to her stuffy apartment only grew. Abby, I'm completely broken, she complained to her friend. Let's go somewhere for the weekend. Only it must be a place near a river or a lake. I swear I'll get in the water and sit there until we leave. Let's go to my grandmother's, Abby exclaimed happily. She lives in a small town. There's a river and a forest around there. At first, Marissa was hesitant about staying at Abby's grandmother's house, since Abby was her granddaughter and Marissa was a stranger. However, Abby assured her that her grandmother was very hospitable, and Marissa eventually agreed to stay on Friday evening. When the women arrived at Abby's grandmother's house, they found her waiting in the garden at a set table. Though they tried to refuse a treat at such a late hour, the old lady wouldn't listen to any excuses. Nothing will happen to your figures. You'll swim tomorrow. It's great for fitness, laughed Mrs. Sandberg. Yeah, sure. Only I don't know how to swim, laughed Abby. How? Marissa and I thought that tomorrow you and I would swim to the other side to race against each other. Abby waved her hands and warned Marissa to drop the idea immediately because the river was treacherous due to its cold underground currents. Even the strongest and bravest guys in town did not dare to swim to the other side. Marissa didn't believe it and even laughed, thinking Abby was just cowardly because she couldn't swim, but Mrs. Sandberg confirmed that it was better to be cautious. Marissa was unstoppable. Early in the morning, while her friend was still in bed, Marissa, wearing a swimsuit and a light robe, ran to the river. A fog floated over the water, creating a quiet and calm atmosphere. Enchanted by the beauty of nature, she plunged into the invigorating coolness of the river. After a couple dozen strong strokes, she found herself in the middle of the river, feeling an incredible calmness. Where's the dangerous river? She snorted, and started to swim toward the opposite shore. But it didn't take long for the icy cold to seize her muscles with unbearable cramps. In despair, she began to call for help. Marissa shouted with all her might, but she realized in her heart that hardly anyone would hear her at that hour. These might have been the last minutes of her life. She lost consciousness, only to come to on the shore later. It turned out that in response to her cry for help, a guy sitting on the riverbank with a fishing rod had rushed into the water. If it hadn't been for his early morning fishing and his ability to perform artificial respiration, that morning would most likely have been Marissa's last. But this was not the only miraculous coincidence. Looking at her savior, Marissa couldn't believe her eyes. "Cameron, is that you? Or am I hallucinating?" she gasped. "Yes, Marissa, it's me. How did you get here? And where had you disappeared? I almost went crazy. Did you feel bad for me?" Marissa looked at Cameron, tears in her eyes, and confessed that she had never felt as good with anyone as she did then, and she was just scared. An hour later, they sat on the spacious terrace of his house, eating delicious apple pie and drinking tea. "Son, maybe you should introduce us," Mrs. Beasley reproached her son. "This is Marissa, my fiancée," Cameron confidently replied. Marissa even coughed in surprise. "You came here yesterday and stayed at Mrs. Sandberg's." Mrs. Beasley was surprised. "Why didn't your fiancé stay in your house?" Cameron calmly lied, saying that Marissa followed strict rules and refused to live under one roof with her fiancé before the wedding. Therefore, in his opinion, they needed to get married as soon as possible. "Don't you want to ask me?" Marissa whispered in protest. "Didn't you remember that you already agreed? We're submitting the application the day after tomorrow, Mum." "She is probably just overheated in the sun," Cameron smiled. "I thought so," Mrs. Beasley said, shaking her head. A noisy wedding took place in town a month later. Cameron admired Marissa, and she eagerly awaited the moment when she would be alone with her beloved again, in his passionate words, dissolving into his tender embrace. The young couple was so absorbed in each other that they thought they were alone, with only their love and happiness reigning around them. 9 months later, Marissa gave birth to a son for her husband. That's how one scandalous visit from a brazen mistress sharply changed Marissa's life. "I should probably thank Jessica," the young mother thought as she first held her baby, born from her beloved man.